Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time I am covering Michael Moorcock's Wizardry and Wild Romance. Wizardry and Wild Romance is a nonfiction book about fantasy fiction by Michael Moorcock, originally published in 1987 by Gollanks. I assume that's how you say it. It's Gollanczz. And I mean, I've definitely read other things published by them and not known how to pronounce the name. And republished in an expanded edition in 2004 by Monkey Brain. It includes a foreword by Moorcock and 6 chapters of text, to which the expanded edition adds an appendix of reviews by Michael Moorcock and a new introduction and afterword by China Mieville and Jeff Vandermeer. Portions of those 6 main chapters were originally published in other places, as were all of the reviews in the appendix. I will begin with the main text. Moorcock's first chapter is a general history of fantasy fiction. This history begins with the end of mythological romances in Western Europe as we move from Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur to Palmerin de Inglaterra and Amadis of Gaul, both later stories in the same genre of chivalric romance that, in Moorcock's argument, have lost the plot. Or, more accurately, they have lost the myth and replaced it with plot. Moorcock states, though concerned with deeds of daring, magic, and human love, there are no such mythic resonances in the decadent romance, and so a modern reader's interest soon flags. Moving forward through time, Moorcock discusses the rise of the Gothic romance and then moves to the fantasy stories of the later 19th century, which also marks the beginning of fantasy's unearthly secondary worlds. Authors like Edgar Rice Burroughs, William Morris, E.R. Edison, and James Branch Cabell are all introduced here. These authors are joined by a host of 20th century fantasy writers until we reach the historical present of the mid-1980s. This historical overview of fantasy fiction is the groundwork for Moorcock's later arguments about precisely which genre elements are important in fantasy and why. The next 3 chapters each engage with one of these elements. The first of these is the landscape of fantasy, not the real world, publishing, and reading, but the fantastical landscapes that are traversed and witnessed in fantasy stories, and the ways that, in Moorcock's argument, romance as a genre connects the exterior landscape of the world with the interior landscape of the hero's mind or soul. Moorcock also uses a number of longer quotations to distinguish between evocative landscapes in text and those that are dull or uninventively described. The next chapter is about the nature of the fantasy heroes themselves, including concerns like their maturity and ethics. The third of these chapters is called Wit and Humor, and it's about precisely those 2 virtues as arrayed against deeply self-serious and quite grim literature. Through all of these chapters, Moorcock excoriates many authors and books, some of which are still well regarded, and many of which are things that have thoroughly fallen out of fashion, as well as highlighting examples of authors that he finds praiseworthy. I haven't read Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy, one of Moorcock's favorites, but M. John Harrison and Gene Wolfe are both favorites of mine that get significant praise, Harrison for his Vericonium series and Wolfe for his Book of the New Sun. If you don't read Wizardry and Wild Romance, you should at least read some M. John Harrison or Gene Wolfe. The 5th chapter is the most infamous in fantasy circles and is titled Epic Coup. In it, Moorcock critiques a particular trend in fantasy, especially British fantasy, a cozy and conservative evocation of rural Englishness, typified in Moorcock's argument by J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, the other Inklings like Roger Lancelyn Green and Charles Williams, Watership Down, and Winnie the Pooh. In the 80s, people weren't really ready for a fantasy author to criticize Tolkien, presumably because almost all the other ones were writing bad Tolkien ripoffs. The criticism of J.R.R. Tolkien's tales, especially of The Lord of the Rings, centers largely on the hobbits, including both that conservative rural Englishness of the Shire itself and also the hobbits' status as juvenile or immature heroes, which was an issue raised in the last chapter. I suspect that how any given reader feels about this chapter will be based on how they feel about the hobbits themselves, and particularly how they think the book itself engages with the hobbits tonally and thematically. For myself, I think that The Lord of the Rings is very deeply concerned with both of these criticisms, and that the juvenile character of the hobbits is presented as a comfortable and convenient innocence that cannot last any more than an individual's childhood can, and the idyllic nature of the Shire as a similarly beautiful and touching but ultimately unsustainable fantasy, and that therefore Moorcock's criticisms of Tolkien are worth being familiar with but don't alter how I feel about The Lord of the Rings. And I started rereading the trilogy after finishing Wizardry and Wild Romance, and I can confirm that it is still one of my favorites. Despite being famous for criticizing Tolkien, most of the criticism in this chapter is directed towards C.S. Lewis and Richard Adams, who, at least in my opinion, fit these criticisms much more closely than does Tolkien. I leave it to the reader to decide whether or not Epic Pooh will sour their opinion of the Inklings, Moorcock himself, or perhaps both. For myself, I found the chapter worthwhile to read, even if I wasn't completely swayed by Moorcock's arguments, and I suspect many readers will have the same experience. The last portion of the main text of Wizardry and Wild Romance is a brief chapter that serves both as a summary of the arguments of the book as a whole, and a chance to touch on a number of authors who are either underread or underrated fantasy writers, or in some cases, authors at the edge of fantasy as a publishing genre, but who are worth seeking out. This chapter is followed by a few pages on sources, including a few critical overviews of the types of literature that Moorcock only had a chance to skim over in the first chapter, like chivalric and gothic romance. As I mentioned before, the reprint edition from Monkey Blood, which is the version that I read, includes 8 reviews written by Moorcock, most originally published in The Guardian, and a new introduction by China Mieville and a new afterword by Jeff Vandermeer. Both Mieville and Vandermeer have books reviewed in the appendix, and Moorcock makes a point in his foreword to state, "Lastly, I would like to add that the appendices were included without the knowledge of Messrs. Mieville and Vandermeer, but before I had seen their generous introduction and afterword." Of the included reviews, I found the review of Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword the most interesting, although once I have read some of the other books reviewed, I will probably return to this section to revisit Moorcock's comments. The introduction and afterword are both great. I haven't read enough from either Mieville or Vandermeer to my own detriment, but what I have read from each has been great, and I guess both will be moving at least a few places up the list. Ultimately, I think Wizardry and Wild Romance is a book worth reading for readers who are interested in the broader fantasy genre, whether or not they come to agree with the arguments presented, or find underread authors who have slipped out of the general attention of fans and the market. I also found it interesting that, in my opinion, the first printing of Wizardry and Wild Romance came out around something of a transitional period in fantasy literature, as many of the Tolkien ripoffs of the 80s would come to be replaced by other flavors of fantasy, particularly a type that feels more contemporary, an almost anti-symbolist, world-heavy flavor of fantasy that largely rejects Moorcock's arguments about the relationship between the fantasy landscape and the fantasy hero's mind in favor of an independent existence of the fantasy world, which responds to forces both scientific and magical in ways that are not always predictable but are driven by definite exterior causes. I'm thinking of things like hard magic systems and gritty realism, as well as modern fantasies where characters embrace a deeply materialist understanding of the world and the power structures that play within it, as opposed to mysticism or transcendentalism. Basically, I mean series like the Malazan Book of the Fallen, A Song of Ice and Fire, and Sanderson's Cosmere. It definitely seems to me that fantasy was moving in that direction by the time Moorcock finished this book. In a way, this makes Wizardry and Wild Romance a departure into its own fantastical world, distinct from our own, separated from us by the passage of time, and also by Mervyn Peake not spawning his own horde of mediocre but earnest imitators. So, all I can say at the end of all that is read Wizardry and Wild Romance. It's great, totally worth checking out. This edition that I have up here is the one that I read. It's got all the extra material in it too. That is going to be it for me for today. I hope that I sounded all right. I made some changes to my audio setup, so I'll listen back to this myself to make sure. But otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I want to thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.